In a previous video, I talked about the so-called Dark Ages, this idea that there was this complete lack of philosophical and intellectual involvement and achievement in the so-called Middle Ages from around 450 to 1350 of the Common Era. Philosophy in the Middle Ages or the medieval period was very much alive and well. It was constrained not so much by political forces as simply social forces, as I mentioned in my previous video. So what actually was going on in medieval philosophy in this period of 450 to 1350? If it wasn't a dark age, what were they talking about? I'll focus here on two main issues that were often discussed by medieval philosophers. The first one was the scholastic debate over faith versus reason. Scholasticism, of course, is what emerged from the situation where people had very little access to ancient texts. They had Aristotle's works on reason, and they had Plotinus's version of Platonism. They had nothing else, pretty much, to deal with. So when you have a very small set of books to contemplate and debate over, your debate is going to be somewhat limited. It's just human nature. Scholasticism, then, is this movement that occurs during the Middle Ages that is discussing the letters, these ancient texts that they did have, that were referred to as the letters, as the basis for all wisdom and reason. And they looked back at the Greek and Roman periods as a golden age, with good reason. The Roman Empire was the pinnacle of human achievement in Europe up to that time, and so everyone looked back at that time as being that pinnacle of cultural achievement. Scholasticism then was looking backwards constantly at the Roman era and what scholarship they had and what scholarship had survived to their current time. A fundamental issue in scholasticism was the question of faith versus reason. Now, we have to stop immediately and understand what was meant by the concept of faith then. It has really changed in meaning over the centuries. Many people today have the false idea that faith means blind obedience, or saying, I have no reason to believe this, but I'll believe it anyway. That's not faith in the Islamic, Jewish, or Christian traditions. It is also not the definition of faith you will find in a dictionary. Merriam-Webster, for example, will tell you that faith is an allegiance to and trust in an authority, either a tradition or a person. Faith, especially in the medieval period, was about loyalty, not irrationality, not denial of evidence. So, if faith isn't the opposite of reason, why was the argument in medieval thought framed as faith versus reason? Well, here's why. The controversy was over the question of from where and how we obtain truth. Remember that we can't be anachronistic, putting today's ideas onto people in the past. What we commonly and blindly think of as faith today is different. In the medieval tradition, faith means that we get truth from an authoritative source higher than the individual. I'll repeat that because it's really important. Faith meant that we get truth from an authoritative source higher than the individual. This sentiment is consistent with the ancient belief in the existence of unchanging, perfect universals. We saw this from Plato, we saw this from Plotinus. Searching for truth meant contemplating the higher universals. That's where truth existed. The idea that one could come to truth on one's own was dismissed as a vain and foolish notion. Truth was universal, not particular, and truth was understood by humanity, not by particular individuals. And truth was understood by humanity as a whole, not by particular individual people. The medievals sought truth from a source higher than the individual, from tradition. Obviously, tradition included the church, but it also included the letters, that collection of authoritative writings, such as those of the ancient philosophers. For a long period after the collapse of the Roman Empire, most thinkers in Europe look back at the Roman period as a golden age superior to the times they currently found themselves in. As the chaos swirled around them, the medieval intelligentsia could not help but look back to earlier times for a sense of stability and wisdom. This admiration for the past encouraged the study of letters, the study of ancient texts. The letters went beyond scripture. They included writings of the church fathers and the writings of scholars including Plato, Plotinus, and Aristotle, among others. Still today we place faith in written authorities. It really is not that much different today in some respects. We consult dictionaries, encyclopedias, and textbooks. When you write a paper, you are expected to cite your sources. When you say that something is true, you are asked, how can you prove that? How can you demonstrate? Where did you get that idea from? What are your sources? The medievals had a similar expectation. If you make an argument, you cite your sources. Scholastic inquiry in the medieval era was a process that began with reading and memorizing the writings of past authorities. Those old writings had to be incorporated into scholarship. This practice is not that far removed from education and academia today. What was different from today was the practice of almost exclusively looking back rather than forward. The attitude in the medieval period was that new thought could not be better than old thought. Scholarly writings had to be based on past authority. It is this attitude, far more than religious suppression, that discouraged original philosophy. Philosophy, and indeed all learning, was a derivative activity based on conformity to the writings of the old masters who knew more than contemporary thinkers. The best that we can hope to do is to copy them and incrementally improve upon the understanding of their wisdom. The medieval Christian expression of faith, therefore, was the allegiance to and following of the authority of tradition. This included, of course, the confession of the Catholic Church and the teaching of the ancient books, the letters. In practical terms, this is applying the inherently philosophical idea that what the ancient authorities said is true and that thinking for yourself is departing from truth. That's where we get the word heresy. Heresy was not originally a religious thought. The word heresy comes from the Greek word hera, that means to choose or to take. To be a heretic is to choose a path that differs from the authorities of old, forming your own opinions contrary to what is authoritative accepted truth. You are choosing to take your own path. The persecution of heretics, which was vile and reprehensible in every respect, was a political persecution of people who thought differently from the prevailing authority. The heretics could have been following their own authorities within their own subcultural tradition, but they were thinking differently from the established tradition, choosing their own path, and therefore were declared heretics. Again, Christianity didn't invent this. This was an attitude of Roman times, an attitude of Greek times as well. The Christian medieval era simply inherited this idea of heresy. So thus, the debate over faith versus reason is about the following question. Must I follow the ancient texts, or can I, as an individual reasoning with my own mind, come to the truth through my own thinking? Most people throughout history, both before and long after the medieval period and up to today, would say, no, you can't come to truth on your own. They instead demand that others conform to established political and cultural beliefs. If you think for yourself, you might end up disagreeing with what the political leaders teach, and then the political structure is threatened. That is still the case today. There is still political pressure to believe that you cannot or should not think for yourself. Separate from politics is the philosophical question of whether an individual mind is capable of coming to truth. If, as the Platonists contended, all truth comes from the good or intellect, then the most that individual people can do is open their minds to that truth. Again, largely because of the wide acceptance of the idea of universals, divergence from tradition was seen as deviation from the universal of human reason. If being a good human is defined as sharing qualities with the universal of humanness, then the more one deviates from accepted practice, the less of a good human one is. Most medieval scholars believed in reason guided by the letters and the tradition of interpretation. Only in the century of the 1000s in the Islamic world and the 1300s in the Christian world did a few bold thinkers start to think outside the box of what everyone assumed scholarship should be. These thinkers argued that through our unaided human reason we can come to understand truths. The philosophical arguments for this rested primarily on the idea that the human mind was created by God and connected to God, and that God meant for us to use the rational capacity that we have been given by God. The counter-argument is that if we have God-given reason, then we should all be thinking the same because God is one. Even without the concept of God, the idea of universals suggested that there should be uniformity of thought. If there is one truth, then anything different from that one truth is got to be wrong. Remember that we cannot place on the past our present-day ideas of perspectival, relative, and subjective experience. The medievals didn't have that, and we would have to wait centuries for those ideas to take hold. In the medieval period, both Christian and Islamic philosophers struggled with the fundamental issues of guided reason versus unaided individual reason. Then we come to the controversy over universals themselves. From Plato on, most philosophers believed that there were such things as universals, ideals like treeness, greenness, justice, and so on. The question was whether universal entities are separate from particular objects. Aristotle said no, but because Aristotle's writings on this were lost, and Plato's Timaeus and Plotinus's writings were available, medieval scholars adopted the Platonic view that universals are real entities. Aristotle's logic, which these scholars did have, strengthened the position of realism, that universals are real entities. Aristotle had said that there was a one-to-one correspondence between reason and reality. Medieval scholars concluded that because we can logically reason about universals, universals must be real. The realist position on universals, that universals are real entities, meant that all objects that shared similarities of kind participated in the same universal essence. All particular trees participate in the universal essence of treeness, and their differences as particular objects are accidental, in other words, not what they truly are. Realism worked for scholars who sought to explain Augustine's doctrine of original sin, that we all inherited the sin of Adam and Eve. The argument is that all particular humans participated in the universal essence of humanity. Therefore, when the first people sinned, the essence of humanity was infected by sin, and therefore all people are unavoidably infected by that sin. It's part of human nature. It's part of the human universal now. Thus, people are inherently sinful, and the only way out of sin is the redemption that changes human essence, which only God can effect. No individual human can change their essence. However, Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142, argued against this realist position. He said that if both a human being and a donkey participated in the universal of animal, then the universal essence of animal is both rational and irrational, which is an obvious contradiction. But Abelard also argued that universals couldn't simply be names or, as anti-realist Roscelin had claimed, vocal winds. Yes, Abelard said, universals are nothing more than names. However, a universal name gets its power not from the word, but from that which the name stands for as a universal concept. A name like human can stand for both a particular human, Plato, and for humans in general. Plato and Aristotle can both be called human because they are both humans. But that doesn't need to be explained by appealing to a separate universal thing. All names are universal, but also general and derived by us through mental abstractions. We understand universals through observing common qualities in particular objects. If that sounds like Aristotle, it is. But remember that Abelard had no access to Aristotle's writings on universals and particulars. He came to these conclusions independently. Abelard adds that universals refer to objective qualities in things, but that those qualities are not independent realities. We mentally apply universal concepts to things and can consider universals separate from things, but they are not actually separate entities. Abelard's position was not accepted by others in his time, though, and wasn't taken up again until another 2 centuries later by John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. But that's for another talk.